Hello there, and blessings of peace to everyone. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani. I am the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices through multi-faith and civic engagement. You may have seen last week we had Mary Nan Huffman, who's running for Harris County District Attorney, and she was the first one to kick off our candidate Q&A series, of which we have about 15 candidates from throughout the greater Houston area working on state, local, and federal elections. Today, we have our second candidate joining us today, Sri Kulkarni, who's running for the second time for Congressional District 22, which encompasses a good portion of Fort Bend County, but also portions of Brazoria County as well, including Pearland. How are you doing, Sri?
Assalamu alaikum. Good to be here, sir.
Thanks for joining us. We know your schedule's been really busy. It's probably a little bit more difficult running for Congress, especially when your district is so large, but spread throughout Fort Bend County and spread throughout Brazoria County. I bet you're accruing all that gas mileage.
Well, actually, we've saved a lot on gas. It's helping the environment because of the pandemic. We're not doing very many face-to-face activities. And our district actually goes from Katy in the northwest down to Sugar Land, across to Pearland, and it ends in Friendswood and Clear Lake in Harris County. So we cover three counties, but we can jump in and out of Zooms now. So anybody who wants to participate and get involved, you can do it from the comfort of your own home now.
Excellent. And I saw Joe Biden just started doing his campaign rallies again. And so have a few other candidates, but it's going to be a slow ease, especially the path to November is going to be a little difficult.
Well, everything safely. I think safety has to be the priority, but you know, if a campaign is about shaking hands, being in someone's home, or doing a big rally, I don't know if we can do that as safely right now. But if it's about organizing communities and connecting people, we can. We just have to be more creative about it. So we run a virtual campaign academy every Sunday where we train people to pull in people from their own network, from their own communities, just with their phone. You can sit on your couch. Everybody that you know is actually, that's the most powerful thing that you have. And this isn't just about winning an election on November 3rd. It's about pulling our entire community together. And so we've trained volunteers to become organizers, graduated a campaign academy already. We're in our second iteration of it. We do virtual town halls every week. If you want to get involved, and you should, because it's the most important election of our lifetime, you absolutely can. And especially if you speak another language, if you speak Urdu or Gujarati or Bangla or Turkish or Arabic or Farsi or any language, or just speak English and want to talk to people and help them understand how important it is, then we invite you to come and join us.
Well, Sri, we really dive straight into your candidacy. Let's talk about your platform a little bit. Could you give us a brief understanding of what are the issues that are most important to Sri Kulkarni?
Sure. So, I mean, from the beginning of this campaign, when we started, and just to take a step back, I was in the Foreign Service for over 14 years. I wasn't involved in politics. The reason I'm here right now is because of the kind of division that I've seen across this country, whether it's attacking the African American community, the Hispanic community, the Muslim ban from December of 2015, and then the Charlottesville Nazi rally. That's when I just decided things had gotten too far, and I couldn't work in this administration. So I resigned and came home to run for Congress. But the things that we're fighting for, I experienced growing up here, just like you did. So growing up as the son of an immigrant, I started out in a 2-bedroom apartment with 9 people, experiencing having to bus across town to get a better public education, witnessing gun violence personally, a broken criminal justice system, flood after flood here. And then, of course, a healthcare system that still the #1 cause of bankruptcy in this country is healthcare costs. And my family almost went bankrupt when my dad was sick with cancer. But right now, the #1 issue, bar none across our society, is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And I think we need to come together around science, not around partisan politics or political ideology. We need to make sure we get our frontline healthcare workers the protective gear they need. We need to have rapid testing, and we need to support our small businesses who are being crushed right now. 1 in 6 small businesses have failed this year. We need to make sure they can get through the pandemic and then help them get loans and startup tax credits to get them scaled up after we get past the pandemic.
Well, speaking of the pandemic, Sri, and this is jumping straight into healthcare, one of the things that the pandemic has revealed is how flawed our healthcare system is. The amount of bottlenecks that have been revealed, not just in terms of funding, but accessibility, costs, equipment, and making sure that those on the front line are physicians, our nurses, our techs, that they're taking care of. It's just revealed so many flaws in our system, more than what we've been talking about as a nation. So for decades, healthcare costs in the US have risen faster than the rate of inflation. Meanwhile, 30% of healthcare spending is estimated to be unnecessary. What policy solutions do you support to address the rising costs of healthcare?
Sure. And so again, this is based on my own experience. So, in my case, I was 18 years old. My father got acute myelocytic leukemia. I had to drop out of University of Texas, come home and take care of him, do his physical therapy, his IVs, take him back and forth to the hospital. And when he passed away, I was 19 and our family was literally taking donations just to stay afloat. It's still the #1 cause of bankruptcy in this country. And I don't think anyone should go bankrupt because of medical costs. And that's a baseline. And so the two biggest issues that I hear about are, one, cost. And we literally have the highest cost out of any developed country in the world. And so the first step is we need to be able to bring down costs, especially prescription drug prices, because you can have 5 people in line at CVS. They're all paying different prices for the exact same drug. And you see people, they go to Mexico, or they'll go to India or Pakistan to get their drugs, right, and then come back here because they're too expensive here in the United States. We shouldn't be subsidizing the rest of the world's drug prices. We should be able to negotiate those prescription drug prices and bring down costs for everybody. And then the second issue, and you hit the nail on the head, it's access to healthcare. And the biggest example of that was Medicaid expansion. So what happened is individual governors, they chose whether to expand Medicaid or not. And what they were actually doing is they were playing political games with people's lives and their health. And it has a disproportionate impact on certain communities. And so here in Texas 22, we've had 40,000 people this year alone who've lost their health care. 650,000 people across the state of Texas have lost their health care this year. And there's a lawsuit going on by the Texas Republicans at this moment, suing to take away healthcare from millions of people. We should be expanding access. I don't think it should be optional based on the state. I think no matter what your zip code, no matter what your ethnic background, you should all have equal access to healthcare, and that means Medicaid expansion throughout the country.
But how are you going to do this policy-wise? Because we hear you, and a lot of what you're saying has been said for years upon years upon years. How are you going to make sure that this is something that you can implement through policy instead of just preaching to the choir?
Well, so I think that's a big part of it. It's not that we don't have solutions to these problems. It's that we don't have the political will to sit down at the table and negotiate. And so that's where I think my background as a diplomat, as a foreign service officer, comes into play. Because if we spend all of our time arguing about the perfect solution and we can't agree on the problems, this is what happened under Obamacare. We had over 60 votes on whether to repeal Obamacare or not. And then once there was a unified Republican government, what did they want to replace it with? Nothing. There was no plan there. So we weren't really talking about policy at all. We were just talking about politics. And what I say to people is, let's agree on those two major problems, cost and access. If everybody can agree on that, and there should not be any disagreement, I don't care what your political background is, that those problems are true in every community. I was in the hospital last year. My nurse, he said he was a Republican. And I asked him, what's your top issue? He said healthcare, because he had a surgery that cost over $100,000. And I asked him, what was your copay? He told me, I couldn't tell you because I haven't paid it off yet and I work in a hospital.
Wow.
This goes across all lines. And so what I tell people is, if I could sit across the table from someone in Iraq who literally wanted to kill me, I can sit across the table from a Republican and work on a healthcare plan that we can actually get past, and we can make sure that we lower cost and we increase access for all of our citizens, because that's what they deserve.
You know, I remember when my wife and I were planning for a family, called up our insurance company and asked, because we had private insurance. I'm self-employed. I was an entrepreneur at the time, still am an entrepreneur, but we had healthcare. This was before ACA came into play, and asked what my wife's coverage would be like for pregnancy, and they said it was a pre-existing condition. And that made absolutely no sense to me. And I obviously didn't understand all the nuances behind insurance and the whole game that's in insurance, but where do you stand on defending protections for people with pre-existing conditions?
Absolutely. And this is something that's very sensitive for a lot of people, because, as you said, things like being pregnant could be a pre-existing condition.
Yeah, and listen, diabetes, cancer, issues with the heart. There's so many things that affect everyday normal Americans.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think 1 in 6 people actually has a pre-existing condition right now. So you're talking about tens of millions of people across this country, and that's what the lawsuit is about. They are suing to take away healthcare from people with pre-existing conditions, and the number one pre-existing condition I get asked about now is coronavirus. If you've tested positive for coronavirus, does that now become a pre-existing condition, and can you be denied healthcare? So I think we have to be absolutely 100% clear that under no healthcare plan would we ever take away protection for pre-existing conditions. That should be a baseline for everybody, because it affects everyone. You don't know who in your family will have a pre-existing condition, and this should be a human rights issue. It shouldn't be a political football.
Speaking of human rights issues, Medicaid. Medicaid and Medicare provide coverage for, I believe it's 120 million people nationwide, and we keep hearing election cycle to election cycle to election cycle, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that these are entitlements. What are your thoughts on any cuts to Medicaid?
So first of all, people need to understand Medicaid. It's not only the source for healthcare for low-income people, but it's also long-term care for a lot of our senior citizens, for example, who desperately need that Medicaid. So it affects all communities, especially, for example, if you live in a multi-generational family, like many of our families in the Desi community do. That affects all of us. But on top of that, the broader question about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, what we're really talking about is it's about dignity for people who desperately need it. People like my mother, who worked her entire life. Her husband died 22 years ago. She raised 4 kids all on her own. And now they're talking about cutting Medicare and Social Security for our seniors who deserve to retire with dignity. And let's just be clear, this is all about smoke and mirrors and a marketing ploy. When they talk about a payroll tax cut or just a payroll tax holiday or whatever you want to call it right now, what they are saying is we are going to cut Medicare and Social Security. In fact, the president has basically talked about wiping away the funding for Medicare and Social Security. So we need to be clear to all of our senior citizens. They want to take away your Medicare. They want to take away your Social Security. Rather than that, I would say probably favor a modest increase in the payroll tax to make sure that our Social Security and Medicare is properly funded. Because that is really what we need. We need to make sure that we cover our senior citizens. Who doesn't want to take care of their parents and their grandparents?
All I heard was you want to increase payroll tax.
I want to make sure that Medicare and Social Security are covered, that they are solvent. What they want on the other side, the president and the Republican Party want to do is they want to cut Medicare and Social Security. They want to cut our retirement, our dignity for our senior citizens, for our parents and our grandparents.
Are you saying Mr. Trump's cuts on payroll taxes directly affect Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid?
Absolutely. That's what they're funded from. And they're trying to trick us. They're trying to tell us that we are going to give you a tax cut. And in fact, a lot of people, the issue that they have this year in particular is people are out of work. We have had 50 million people file for unemployment. So that payroll tax cut doesn't help them. And it's disingenuous in multiple ways. A, it doesn't help the people who are out of work right now. B, he's not actually talking about a tax cut. They're actually talking about repaying it. So it's a loan that you have to repay in next year after the election. But C, the most important thing, if you are funding something for your parents or grandparents, whatever it is, and you take away that source of funding, you are attacking those senior citizens. We should be very clear about what it is. This is an attack on all of our senior citizens across this country.
Speaking about attack on senior citizens, there is a portion of our community who has largely gone incredibly underserved. Sri, they have fought for our nation, whether we agree with these wars or disagree with the wars. What we can say is veterans have put their lives on the line for our nation. And we're not even just talking about the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. We're still talking about Vietnam. We're still talking about Korea. These veterans are people who suffer from PTSD. Sometimes it goes diagnosed. Sometimes it goes undiagnosed. What would you do to improve the delivery of timely, quality healthcare to veterans?
So first of all, my uncle served 2 tours in Vietnam. My grandfather and all of his brothers served in World War II. As a foreign service officer, I served in Iraq on a military base with veterans who desperately need these kind of services when they transition back home. And I will tell you two big things. One is that once you come back home, some people are able to adjust back to civilian life. Other people, they fall off the wagon. And so we need to have transition services. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to establish a veterans transition center out here in the suburbs, because going into the VA, if you ever go there, it's a huge maze trying to navigate all of these systems. And especially if you're having problems, if you're having PTSD, if you're having difficulty adjusting, you need that transition support. Specifically in terms of healthcare, I've dealt with people when I worked in the US Senate. I worked on Veterans Affairs. People who have severe problems with PTSD and other mental health problems. We need to have access for other alternative therapies, for example, for these veterans. We need to give them more options for their healthcare. But what we do not need to do is we should not be cutting away their healthcare. We shouldn't be privatizing their healthcare. They deserve that healthcare. And when you talk to veterans, the vast majority of them actually appreciate the services they get through the VA. So we need to strengthen the VA, not weaken it.
Got it. And, again, going back to underprivileged communities, shifting a little bit away from healthcare, in our country, we have an enormous problem with the correctional system, which directly ties into the justice system. An issue that we're very passionate about here at Minaret Foundation, and that the larger community is passionate about, especially in Harris County and Fort Bend County, is the school to prison pipeline. Statisticians, sociologists, many people who have studied the concept of the school to prison pipeline have identified a pattern of when someone is arrested in elementary school or middle school or high school, and then seeing what that pipeline looks like, straight to being suspended again, suspended once more, going to ISS, and then ending up either in the juvenile justice system or in the larger correctional system. The school to prison pipeline is something that's very real, and it affects all communities. It's something that is tragic. It's very unfortunate. I was telling people about a story that I know from the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, where a child stood up to bullies. He was 9 years of age, Latino child. He stood up to bullies and he was arrested. He didn't have proper legal counsel. He was sentenced to doing time in juvie at 9 years of age for standing up to a bully. And the school, by the way, had a zero tolerance policy. That's here in Houston. This child spent time in the juvenile justice system without a single visit from his parents. You might be thinking that his parents might be cold-hearted, but his parents are undocumented. So they feared that if they went into the correctional facility, that they would be deported, which wasn't the case, obviously, but that's the way they felt. So for such a long period of time, this 9-year-old child who stood up to bullies was in a correctional facility. This child gets out. He is surrounded by these people in juvenile, and then he starts a pattern of going down essentially the wrong path. The school to prison pipeline is something that's very real. In fact, if a student is arrested in high school, they are 50% more likely to drop out before graduation. And many high school students are arrested due to just simple misconduct, disobeying a teacher, disobeying the principal, arrested for that. Many high school students are arrested due to misconduct, and this is often referred to as the school to prison pipeline. What is one concrete step and maybe a policy that you would take to combat the school to prison pipeline?
Sure. And this is something that I also saw personally growing up. I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood where there was a lot of violence and a lot of crime, but there was also, mistrust of the police in our area. And I bust across town to get a better education than the one in my area. But we shouldn't have to do that. We should all have equitable access to education, and we shouldn't have these children who diverge on their path so early. I mean, I'm glad you pointed out, we're not even talking about just high school. We're talking about elementary school kids.
Right.
Even say that an elementary school kid is being arrested in their school. That should be shocking to all of us. And as you point out, when people get removed from their class, or even worse, get incarcerated at such a young age, it dramatically changes the trajectory of their entire life. And so I would say one huge thing that we could do is to make sure that we're not removing students, but we have alternative options available, and they're based on evidence, not just based on ideology. This goes for all of my policies, by the way. We have to base them in evidence. not on partisan ideology. And in this case, restorative justice, I think, is something that we've seen it through evidence that it actually works when you bring people together and have the student and the person who they've been involved with the situation actually talk about these issues and try to come to these resolutions without removing the student from that environment. That can be one of the most impactful ways to heal these issues, to deal with these issues as they occur, rather than creating new issues. Because trust me, if you remove that student, or if you put them into the juvenile detention system, or even worse, incarceration earlier on, as you mentioned, it doesn't get better. It gets worse from there. They get exposed to worse and worse things, and their life deviates from all of their classmates. We need to heal that and bring our communities back together, and we need to start from the earliest ages.
Speaking of starting from the early stages, there's so many children, specifically children of color, who have fallen victim to unequal policing and disciplinary policies in school. We're not talking about police reform at the moment. Yeah. What is one way you would ensure that children have equal access to the education system, to our public schooling, to opportunity, to safety?
Yeah. Sure. So, I mean, what I've seen is that there's been, in some places, there's investment in these administrative superstructures, when some of that investment could be made in teachers, more highly educated teachers, more motivated teachers, restructuring so we can give more time, more individual class time, smaller classes. And I've seen it from looking at other educational systems across the world, because not every country does it exactly the same. For example, in Finland, I asked them, because they have the gold standard for education in the world. I asked them, how do you deal with these situations? And they say, well, we actually, when students need more specialized attention, we put them in smaller classes. The smallest class sizes they said were 6 people. And then those are the students that need the most attention. And there's other students that perhaps need to be able to go ahead. Right? They're more self-motivated, and so you can adjust the resource allocation to those students so that everyone is getting the proper amount of attention that they need, rather than penalizing people, holding people back, and actually punishing students if they're not exactly like all the rest of their classmates.
Well, shoot, one of our viewers, who also happens to be one of our staff members, and we see there's lots of questions in our Facebook feed from Mo, Salima, Nafis, and others. We'll get to those questions in just a moment. But Samra asks, is there any specific legislation that you would possibly support that could be enacted to counter the school to prison pipeline? Thank you, Samra.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what we can do from the federal level, at least, because to be honest, there's different responsibilities here at the local level, at the ISD level, there's at the state level funding for the public education system. At the federal level, we also have funding sources. I mean, that's the power of Congress, the power of the purse. So I think if we put investment in those places, if we know where school districts, local school districts, state public education systems who are being extremely hard hit, especially right now in 2020 because of the pandemic, if we can make sure we make those investments where people need it the most, in the kind of both counseling, mental health services, and education of teachers of how to deal with these problems in the schools, rather than taking it to a criminal justice approach. We should never go to the harshest possible approach first, and that's true with the war on drugs. It's true with the school to prison pipeline. It's true with all of these things. Don't go to the harshest approach first. Try to start with the simplest, the most direct approach that actually helps people on the ground before you escalate them. And I think the federal government can make those investments in places where it's desperately needed.
I don't have any follow-up questions to that. Usually it's like I have something to go back and forth with, but I absolutely agree with that. And I think many of our friends in the multi-faith community would agree on that. One of my good friends, Pastor David Sincere, this is something that he's working on with DA Middleton, and he's always talking about the same legislation, same policies that you're speaking about. Switching gears a little bit. Since 2016, for whatever reason, there has been a 30% increase in hate crimes across the board. We're talking anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, acts of violence against people of color, Latinos, xenophobia, in just recently as of this year. But we also have Congress people who have shared worrisome posts regarding Muslim Americans and other minorities. Recently, self-proclaimed Islamophobe Laura Loomer won a nomination in Florida with our friends in the Republican Party. Her hateful rhetoric surrounding Muslims, it's really terrifying for all. But she's been successful. She's been able to leverage that rhetoric, and she's been able to leverage anti-Semitism to gain candidacy for public office. What would your first step be to combat Islamophobic rhetoric, to combat anti-Semitic rhetoric, to combat any kind of hateful rhetoric, whether it be through policy or through public statements?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, this goes to the heart of why we are here in the first place, why we're engaging in this campaign. And the examples that you cite, I mean, for me, an attack on the Muslim community, an Islamophobic attack, isn't just a problem for the Muslim community. It's a problem for our entire society. When someone walks into an African-American church in Charleston, for example, and murders African Americans trying to start a race war, that's not just a problem for the African American community. When someone walks into a synagogue in Pittsburgh, that is not just a problem for the Jewish community. And when someone attacks an Asian family in Midland or kills a group of Latinos in El Paso, all of these are problems for our entire community because it's about the soul of our country. And so we need to stand up against it. We need to speak out as leaders here. When we have public officials, elected leaders who say things like calling for a ban on all Muslims, like that's one of the most dramatic examples. It's a violation of our fundamental values as Americans. And I personally, I spoke out about it from day one back in December 7th of 2015 against these kind of divisive attacks on specific communities. But then we do have to have policies. And so I think we need to recognize hate crimes where they exist. We need to, so our leaders should, there's 9 points. Acknowledge the hate crimes, conduct outreach to communities and civil society groups, sponsor laws that establish specific offenses and enhance penalties for hate crimes, provide instructions and resources to law enforcement bodies, support hearings and investigations into the problem of hate crimes, because that's an important function of US Congress, require monitoring and reporting on those hate crimes, third-party complaint procedures to encourage greater reporting of hate crimes, and lastly, we need to strengthen institutions and bodies that work on anti-discrimination.
You know, Sri, I love these 9 points, but I don't want to get to the point where we have a hate crime. Meaning, once we have the hate crime, okay, I see that there's some mechanisms right now. I don't agree with all of them. One of the things that we're working on right now with our friends in the Jewish community is hate crimes reporting, which unfortunately hasn't gotten much support. You know, hate crimes, our municipalities don't have to report hate crimes to the federal government, which, well, I could talk about this for hours. Talk to me about what policies, what steps would you take to make this a more inclusive country, to make our area or CD22 a more inclusive area, so we don't get to the point of hate crimes? How can we make sure that we're talking to one another? Is this even something that Congress can do?
No, absolutely. I think it's something that Congress can and should do, and all of us in public life, whether we're an elected official, whether we're a community leader, I think we have an obligation to do this right now, because what we have seen, what I'm talking about over the last few years, and the reason why we started this campaign, is a ripping apart of our society. This kind of division, this anger, this hatred is something that we have to combat together. And so my answer is always, I mean, it's based on the philosophy of Martin Luther King. And that is that hate does not drive out hate. Only love can do that. Darkness does not drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And so we are attempting to run the most inclusive campaign ever in Texas and hopefully American history. And so what does that mean in practice? It means pulling in people from every immigrant community. We are now campaigning in 27 different languages, which has never been done in American history. It means every faith community. So we've had the most number of Muslim volunteers, most number of Hindu volunteers. We have Sikh, Parsi, Jain, Jewish, Christian, Sunni Muslim, Ismaili Muslim, Bori Muslim, all of the diversity that we have here in Texas 22. And I think that's our strength. We should be showing the rest of the country how we come together to face great challenges, whether it's racial strife or whether it's the pandemic. Those kind of things, when we pull together across our different communities, when we uplift people. So that means things like, my first campaign manager was Muslim. It means campaigning for hijabi women who are out there facing vicious Islamophobic attacks right here in Fort Bend and in Pearland, to go out and speak out against those. Make sure we stand up and say that we are all part of one community. That's the example that we need to set, because children are watching. Children are watching, and I can tell you the kind of discrimination, the things that I heard growing up here, I hear them even worse in the high schools today. And so we should be setting that better example as any kind of public official or community leader on how we stand up to these things by becoming more inclusive.
You know, talking about Islamophobia, talking about hate, talking about inclusivity with other communities, is a question that many of our viewers have been asking, especially as we're inclusive of other minorities, other faith traditions, and making sure that they're respected. There are claims that you have received funding from the RSS, and the RSS is a group that directly impedes upon the freedom of Muslims and other minorities in India. But we also know that the RSS has a strong lobby here in the United States as well, where there's an agenda to either misrepresent the creation of India, the role of the current government, or even the future pathway of the current government, even misrepresenting maybe what is happening with Muslims and other Christians, by the way, not just Muslims. This is an issue dealing with minorities, with Muslims and Christians in India. I know on your website that you address these rumors, but can you address them for us here today? Talk to us about maybe some of the funding that you may have received, and what are your thoughts on religious persecution, especially state-funded, state-mandated, from the highest level of persecution of Muslims and minorities in India?
Sure. So I have seen these attacks, and I've seen these kind of things spreading across social media, and it pains me, not just as an individual, but because a lot of the people being attacked are actually Muslim leaders, Muslim supporters of ours, Muslim organizations. And let me just be clear with everybody out there. We do not get any funding from RSS or HSS or any foreign organization whatsoever. Our ideology in this campaign is based on what I believe American ideology to be. And that is the proposition that all people are created equal. And everyone of any national origin, of any race, of any faith, of any gender, they should all be treated equally with dignity and respect. And we have been clear about that from day one of this campaign, that this is what we stand for. And personally, I have risked my life overseas for this country because I believe in the values of this country, the things that hold us together across our diverse communities. And those are the things that we have stood for and we will always stand for.
So what about some of the donors who may have unsavory ties? It's specifically, and we're not just talking about donors who've given a couple bucks here and there. These are donors who may have given thousands and thousands of dollars to your campaign, who have unsavory ties to organizations which are a little hateful, or which are pretty hateful, if I'm speaking very frankly. How do you feel about that? How does that work?
So just let me first of all say that these concerns, I understand where they come from. I think they're valid concerns, and these are questions that deserve to be answered because people need to know who is representing them.
Yes.
So just to address the question of funding. So our campaign doesn't take any corporate PAC contributions. In fact, over 90% of our funding comes from individuals, and we have over 11,000 individual supporters over the last 3 years. We have raised millions of dollars. And so each one of these individual supporters, what they're buying into is they're buying into our campaign and our ideology. The implication is that if someone supports our campaign, that means that we support exactly what they support, and that's just not true. We have to, by necessity, have a coalition of supporters. In this district in particular, we have the second most diverse county in the entire country, and we have to pull people together. And they don't always have to agree on everything, but what they're buying into in our campaign is something that's always stood for equality, dignity, and respect, even before we started. You know, the reason why we started this campaign, my entire career, going back 17 years, is about standing up for minorities and fighting for equality. And so we have never discriminated based on any of those categories, especially not on faith. and we never will. And no individual donor is going to influence our campaign's values, and no one ever has.
So you're saying because of the diverse makeup of your campaign, especially since you have, I think if I recall correctly, you've got Muslims, Latinos, you've got people of color, Asians, the gamut, and different faith traditions as well. You're saying because of your campaign makeup, the values of your campaign, you do not, this concern about you discriminating against Muslims, especially in India, you feel that this is a non-issue?
No, what I'm saying is that we have been very clear about our values through our actions, through my career, through everything that we have done, through being more inclusive. That's the way. That it's not the only approach, but the way to deal with these kind of divisions. From my background as a diplomat working in conflict zones, is to be more inclusive, to offer a better way to attract people, to draw people in, because let's be honest, there are some nefarious forces here. There
are, and not just here, not just in India or in other countries. Not to continue hammering on India, but since that's the example, but even in our own country, we've seen lobbying reach that's influenced people at the highest levels.
Well, all right, so let's actually address both of those. So one is right here in our own community, where I've seen horrible Islamophobic attacks. I've seen people calling for violence against Muslims, camps against Muslims, saying Islam is not a religion. And you can see, and I encourage people to look at our opponent, because these people are going to the other side. We know where these people reside. They're in our opponent's camp, and we are trying to do the opposite. We are trying to offer an inclusive message. And I don't push anyone out of our camp. If someone voted for Donald Trump, for example, or donated Trump, I'm not going to push that person out of our camp. I want to attract them with a more inclusive message to persuade people, because there's a tension. There are people pulling on both sides. For example, in the Hindu community, there are people trying to pull them to the other side towards more of that hateful rhetoric, and we're trying to push
nationalistic.
Now, when we talk about foreign policy, I think the principle is the same. I will fight for the Muslim community and all communities, both here in Texas, in the United States, and abroad. And when we're talking about things overseas, we're talking about human rights. And this goes away from the political question of coalition building here, which is absolutely necessary for any minority group to achieve a positive change, to policy overseas. The big difference is that we are fighting for representation here. We're not fighting for representation overseas. It's about negotiation overseas. And it's not the only approach, but this is my approach based on my career as a foreign service officer, as a diplomat working on trying to reduce tension overseas, is that direct negotiation is the first step in these. And this is where I believe, like I said, I don't have all the answers, and I don't claim to, but I believe that that skill set that I bring to bear, that experience, can be especially beneficial in this area, because I know that there are human rights issues in India, in China, in Burma, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in countries all over the world. The question is, what do we do about it? If our goal is to improve human rights in these places, how do we approach it? And my approach is to work with, directly engage that government, because we don't have control over those countries. There are other governments we have to work with, but we speak out. The idea that we would be silent about these issues is completely false. And I can give you examples. I've spoken about constituents of mine not being able to communicate with their friends, their relatives, their family members in Kashmir. I've spoken out against violence in Delhi. And there's a concern that's been raised with me. What if citizenship rights get stripped away from Indian Muslims? And of course, I'll speak out against those. But as a diplomat, there's a ladder of engagement here. And I think you need to be in the room in order to engage with the host government. You need to not be pushed out. And there's another approach that starts with condemnation or attacks on an individual or a government or an organization. And in my experience, that's not the first step on the ladder of engagement. In fact, the best way is to actually be allowed in the room, to have a seat at the table. But the bottom line in all of this is that I will do everything in my power to advance human rights for the Muslim community and all communities, both in the United States and anywhere in the world.
Sri, talking about engagement, could you tell us a little bit? See, at Minaret Foundation, me specifically, we're always criticized about engaging people, that maybe don't represent the best values of humanity, that may not see me necessarily as a human being, agree that Islam is a actual faith tradition, or that I have value, or I bring value to society, or that I'm even American. We have to deal with people in our organization. We have to deal with people to move the agenda forward. Right now, we're working on building a multi-faith coalition around the issue of evictions, and I'm actually going to be reaching out to my good friend Pastor Sincere about this in a moment. But sometimes we have to sit on a table with people that we don't agree with. How does that principle or that concept flow with you?
So I appreciate that tremendously. I mean, I created a group in 2016 after I felt so divisive in this country, because I remember, I mean, I think all of us probably remember how we felt in November of 2016. And I felt that my identity as an American, as a human being, had been attacked. And I was wondering, how do we come back together after this? And so I got together with a Republican colleague, and we started a group called Breaking Bread. And the point is not to debate, because when you debate, no matter how politely you do it, you're trying to score points against the other side. And that's not what we're trying to do. What we were trying to do is to understand the other person's perspective, put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And so we would sit down at a table for a meal once a week. And it's kind of like marriage counseling, where you care about that relationship. So a first person would talk about something that concerned them, not an issue, a policy issue, but something that they felt. And another person would have to not respond, but restate that in different words. And usually what would happen is the first person would say, well, you didn't really understand how I felt. You had a caricature of it. And so we'd have to go back and forth a few rounds before the first person says, now you get it. You see what it's like from my position, why I'm so worried, concerned about this issue. Then you open it up to the rest of the group and ask them if there's any way to address the first person's concerns without violating the second person's values. And you don't always have an answer, but it puts you in a different frame of mind. And what you find is that if you peel back the labels, if you start without putting labels on people, there are very similar values to all human beings. We care about our families. We care about our children, their education, their safety. We care about the health of our families. We care about our senior citizens, our parents and our grandparents, and protecting them. We care about pride in our family, our community, and our country. And if you acknowledge that these are the values that unite us, the things that all human beings feel, then you can actually bring people together before you get to those differences, because the differences can be worked out at a table like adults. But if you line yourself up into different tribes, then people start to feel like their tribe is being attacked. And that's what we're trying to get past.
You know, sometimes hate has been presented to us on a silver platter, and it's the people in power that want to divide us more than we actually realized, and to prevent the conversation from going forward, to prevent us from coming together. Because when people come together on both sides of the aisle, we really get things done that affect society, that affect our communities, that affect humanity at large. What are your thoughts on division and chaos in our country as it stands today?
So I think that our society is literally ripping apart right now. And there are people who are trying to inflame that tension, who are trying to make it worse. And there's an alternative vision, and a vision of inclusion. And I say inclusion not just in the sense of diversity, because diversity is who we are. We can live in communities right next to each other, but inclusion is what we do. We give people a seat at the table. We give people a voice. We pull people together. And I think that is the answer. Because if we win these elections on November 3rd, but people are still just as angry with each other, then we haven't really won. We have to pull our society back together. And in this case, I would say, especially for people who are concerned about this election, because I think this is the most important election of our lifetimes. What's happening in this country, the pandemic that we're facing, which has affected our economy, it's affected our education system, it's affected our health. Almost 200,000 people are dead. We have to face these challenges together, and look at the record on both sides. And I think it should be clear. You look at who has embraced division, who has supported the president 100%, who proposed things like the Muslim ban, who has had people in their campaign who have called for violence and camps against Muslims, or who said that Islam is not a religion, who has not had a diverse group of representation in their leadership council in the second most diverse county in the country. Sure. Who has no African Americans, no Latinos, no South Asians, when that's the majority, that's more than 50% of the district, who doesn't represent all communities, who has made Islamophobic statements themselves, for example, right, himself, and has not spoken out against it in 16 years in public office. And so I would say that the reason that this district in particular is so important for the Muslim community, let's say specifically for the Muslim community, Texas is the largest Muslim state in America. Texas 22.
Wait, can we adjust that statement for a second? Because you're going to get me killed. Texas is not the largest Muslim state.
By
Texas,
population?
Yeah, no, what we should say instead is Texas has the largest population of Muslims in the country. Texas, just to put a disclaimer to all those who are watching, Texas is not a Muslim state. We never purported it to be. There's no Sharia law come in, right? Things are still normal. I'm still having medium rare steak. We're A-okay here.
So, okay, I will readjust the order of my sentence then to be clear. What I mean is, yes, the Muslim community in Texas is the largest one in the entire country.
Yes.
Muslim community in Texas 22 is the largest out of any district in Texas. So representation here matters. People have a stake in this election, and we need someone who will be a friend of the Muslim community, who will fight for the Muslim community, who will stand up for the Muslim community and all communities, because that's what it takes in a diverse district to be inclusive. And what have they shown? Not just what they'll say today, but what have they shown throughout their campaign and throughout their career? And that's what we're talking about here. So I guess what I would ask to the Muslim community and all communities, because I give the same message to the Muslim community, the Hindu community, the Jewish, the Christian, everyone, is that who do you trust? Who do you trust to actually work on these issues, to listen to the community, to hear those concerns and advocate for those concerns in Washington, D.C., who has been by your side this entire time? And that's what we're trying to do right now. And I invite people to look at the records and compare, see what have we done to try and be as inclusive as possible, because I think that is the answer. It's the answer to coronavirus. It's also the answer to the racial strife that we've seen across this country this year, is to pull more people together and show what a unified coalition can do, and set a better example for the rest of the country from right here in Texas 22.
So, Sri, speaking about Muslims and Islamophobia and ensuring that we're a diverse society, let's move a little bit to the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in China. Yeah. We know that millions of them have been put into concentration camps. The United Nations has said time and again, never again, never again, never again. And it is also said that that the situation of the Uyghurs meets all the qualifications of genocide. The Office for International Religious Freedom, which is led by Ambassador Brownback in Washington, D.C., they are incredibly concerned. They've spoken out about it numerous times. Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Menendez have sponsored a bill, have co-sponsored several bills about the Uyghur issue, and they have also had sanctions put on them by the CCP. What steps can we take as a nation to help free the Uyghur people? And what steps would you take to ensure that products our nation purchases were not created by Uyghur forced labor?
So first of all, what's happening to the Uyghur community is a horrible tragedy. And I think, as you mentioned, it's been recognized all over the world. And importantly, it's been recognized by the diaspora Chinese community here too, because they can be an ally in this. But the strongest thing that we can do, I think, and this is from my experience in diplomacy, the strongest thing that we can do is to gather together with our allies, because a big mistake, I believe, of the current administration is to go away from multilateral diplomacy, go to unilateral actions, because that actually weakens our position with respect to other countries. So if we, together with the community of nations, can put pressure on the Chinese government to address this serious human rights violation, I think that's where we have the best leverage. We have the best leverage, not just as one individual nation, but as a community of nations saying, these are our values, this is what we stand up for. And I agree with you. We should not be taking advantage of labor in concentration camps or in forced labor situations in China. I think we should all be able to agree on that, and we should be able to push forward legislation that puts that pressure on. But I think it's only going to have an impact when we pull together with our allies, because what's happened is that we have gone away from our democratic allies like Canada, like Australia, like our democratic allies in Europe, and we have gone towards unilateral actions, and that's the worst thing for diplomacy, and it's the worst thing if we want to see changes on these issues in these other countries. We need to come together with our democratic allies in a much more strong way that recognizes we share those values as a community of nations.
Speaking of coalition building, the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians has dragged on for decades. During the latter half of the Obama administration, Palestinian leadership embraced a two-state solution, right? And we've seen multiple administrations have said two-state solution. And even today, we're still talking about a two-state solution, but it's threatened by factors such as West Bank annexation. It's threatened by an institutional blockade in Gaza by the Israeli government. And there's several more threats that we could just go on for hours. How do you rank the peace process amongst your foreign policy priorities? And will you support the Palestinian quest for statehood?
So I worked on this issue directly in Jerusalem for 3 years as a foreign service officer, and I personally believe that the solution here, the only solution that allows two peoples to live in peace and dignity, is two states for two peoples. And I have supported a two-state solution throughout my entire career, and I believe that is the right way forward. And as the United States, I think we should continue to push for that as much as possible, and facilitate, encourage, do whatever we can. And this is what I worked on when I was in Jerusalem. In particular, with respect to the blockade in Gaza, I think there are alternative options. So, for example, the United States providing aid, because the blockade, it does stop people from getting necessary goods coming into Gaza. And if we can provide that aid ourselves, so that the Israeli government will feel comfortable with the aid coming in, that it's not being used for things that are violent, but we can still make sure that we're delivering that humanitarian aid. That should always be the key, because what happens in these situations, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's anywhere in the world, is that civilians, ordinary people, get caught up in these conflicts. And I see it happen again and again. And that's where the human rights issues come into play. And we need to put those civilians first. We need to put those families first. We need to make sure that we're addressing humanitarian situations first and foremost.
Well, should just give you a little bit of pushback. In Gaza, they're all civilians. There's no military force there. I mean, if we're talking about the police force, everyone has been enveloped into this conflict in Gaza. A good amount of people have been enveloped in West Bank. And we're looking at, instead of just humanitarian aid, I'd like for this to be over.
Absolutely.
And the Palestinians would have liked for it to be over, decades ago. So I love the idea of humanitarian relief and making sure they have a comfortable lifestyle. What I'm more interested in, I think what the majority of the Muslim community, what I think the majority of the world is interested in, is how do we put an end to the world's largest open prison, known as Gaza? And do you feel annexation hurts or helps that process?
Annexation in the West Bank? I think that hurts the process. Absolutely. I'm completely opposed to annexation in the West Bank. And I think most people in the community of nations agree on that. So, I mean, the question is, what can we do? And I think we should continue, as the United States, we should continue to push for a recognition that there are two states that should have two sovereign nations, and we should have citizenship for two peoples there. That is the only solution, I think, that is workable in the long term for peace and security and dignity of humanity for both peoples.
So with your experience at state, would you have any ideas of how you believe that the Israelis and the Palestinians should come onto the same table for better understanding, for peace in their lands, and so their children can grow up on swing sets without the idea of maybe there's a bomb or a missile or a tank is about to roll in or soldiers are about to come in? How do we make sure that these children are raised in a peaceful area?
So I honestly think it comes down to political leadership. So I mean, there has to be the will to come together and say we're going to make advances for our entire community, and it has to come on both sides. And it can't be dictated, even if we wanted to. It can't be dictated by an outside force. We can facilitate, we can attract, we can make offers. That's what we do as diplomats. But at the end of the day, there has to be political leadership that comes together and says it's in the good of both of our peoples to end this conflict and to have two peoples living side by side in dignity. But these moments come. We never know exactly when they're going to come in human history. There's a lot of situations in the world we thought were permanent situations, and then they change in a very short period of time. I think the best thing that we can do, and sometimes it takes years or decades to get to that point, but the best thing that we can do is to try to encourage that and try to create those conditions for peace when that political will is there. But to be honest, we're not the world's policemen. It depends on the leadership within those communities.
Actually, moving away from foreign policy for a second, and as we wrap up, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I know we had mentioned 45 minutes in our email, and it's gone on a little bit longer, and we'll be offering Sheriff Nels the same amount of time as well. Let's come back to a little bit more of a domestic priority, which actually it's a global priority. Recently, New Zealand's Prime Minister Ardern stated that by 2030, New Zealand would be carbon neutral. I'm not afraid to say she's sort of a personal hero of mine. You've seemed to be pretty passionate about climate change, and you've mentioned implementing evidence-based climate change reforms. It's on your website. It's in a few videos of you on YouTube and some of your speeches. Climate change is something that has directly impacted us in Houston, right? Hurricane Harvey and all these hurricanes and everything that's happening in the Gulf of Mexico right now and in the Atlantic Ocean is unprecedented. We're seeing melting in the polar ice caps at unprecedented levels. We're seeing climate refugees all around the world. What is one step that you would take to make climate change reforms a reality? And what type of reforms would you want to take?
Sure. So I actually have a whole list of interventions. And I go to evidence-based policy. So I look at the drawdown list. If people aren't familiar, I would encourage them to go look at it because it tries to evaluate the gigatons of carbon that will be removed from the atmosphere over the next 30 years with each one of these interventions. And some of them are related to the things that we normally assume are related to climate change, like fossil fuel usage, but other things have to do with situations we don't talk about, such as proper refrigerant management, proper waste management, proper land usage, et cetera. And I think it all needs to be tied to evidence. And so some of the things that I think we can do right here in Texas, we are the leader in oil and gas, absolutely, but we are also the leader in wind. We should be the leader in solar. We're not yet. And so I think that there's a false dichotomy of cutting away jobs or cutting away jobs or damaging the environment. And I think we can preserve the environment. We can combat climate change while still having a strong and growing economy. And the way we do that is by creating the new jobs of the 21st century. We expand in solar, which means we have to put it as a technological challenge to our people. And the greatest example is, John F. Kennedy. He challenged our country to go to the moon in 10 years. That seemed like a much farther off goal than what we're talking about with climate change at that time, but we accomplished it. So we have incredibly talented, smart people, engineers, all working in the energy industry here. Put them on these tasks. So a couple examples. In order to be the leader in solar, we need to have proper storage capabilities for energy. So I was talking with a company the other day that is supercooling air into a liquid for storage. Finding the right way to transport that energy. It means tying our grid. We have a separate grid in Texas called ERCOT, which is separate from the major eastern grid and the major western grid. Tying those grids together makes a huge difference. Looking for alternative ways to use the same kinds of technology. So if your expertise is in drilling, you can actually drill deeper. And the reason that you should drill deeper, go to Iceland. How do they power most of their country? Geothermal energy. So you can actually drill deeper into the earth. We have incredibly talented, capable, smart people, and we can come up with the technological solutions. We just have to have the will to invest in those kind of jobs for the 21st century. And I think the best example is Norway, which their number one source of revenue for their country is oil. What do they do with that revenue? They invest it in a renewable energy economy. And I think that's the best way to pull people together. Make sure that we are actually combating climate change, which is real. It is not a hoax. It is science. But we're also creating new jobs. We're expanding our energy economy and making sure that we continue to lead and give people opportunities to provide a livelihood for their families, because that is not a true choice. That is a false choice, and we should be able to create jobs and protect our environment at the same time.
You spoke about Norway reinvesting its profits into renewable energy sources. Well, what incentives would you advocate for to help accelerate the transition to renewable energy sources? And because, this isn't just a climate change question, this is a national security question. As a nation, we cannot be dependent upon, in the long term, we just can't be dependent upon foreign oil. It's not healthy for our economy to grow. It doesn't give us the independence that we need to grow. And it really stagnates us. So what incentives would you advocate for?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the direct incentive that Congress can provide is tax credits to people who are investing in these kind of technologies. So, for example, there are people in our district right now who are working on carbon sequestration technology. That could be tremendously helpful to us in addressing this problem. So as long as you're putting the economic incentives in there for people to make these investments. And people sometimes forget that the government has made big investments before. You can look at our iPhone. Almost everything in there originally came from investments made by the federal government, and they lead to the technology that we use every day. If we put those investments in, as you rightly say, these are investments. These are investments in the future of our country, the future of our planet. Then you will get the technology that is necessary, because we have the minds. We just have to make sure that it makes sense for people.
Well, Sri, we're talking about climate change here a little bit, and it's sort of making me worry at the same time. Personally, I'm a huge proponent of climate change activism, but our city, we're the oil and gas hub of the world. I think almost all of my friends either work in or are connected to ONG. Does talking about climate change and moving us towards more of a carbon neutral nation or adhering to the treaty in Paris, does that contribute to a loss of jobs or a loss in the ONG economy?
Absolutely not. And first of all, I'm glad you brought up Paris, because these are the kind of things that we would work on in my profession, in the Foreign Service, pulling together the advocates for Paris and then making sure that we promote that, because there's not one environment, there's not one atmosphere. This is a global challenge that we have to work together with the community of nations on. And I think it's true in those European countries I talked about, it's true in Asia, and it's true in the United States that we have the people, we have the skill set to deal with these problems. And I don't think that it's a choice between jobs and the environment. I flat out reject that. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge that we can rise to. So we have to, as public officials, as elected leaders, we have to put that challenge to our people. What will it take? What will it take to move towards a renewable economy? What technology will you need? What investments will we need to solve this problem together? That's the orientation that we have to have. It is not an either or, an us versus them, and all of the people who are working in that industry. Like I said, the engineers, the incredibly brilliant and gifted people right here in Houston. When at the turn of the 20th century, when we invented, when we had internal combustion engines and we had cars, people said, oh, there's going to be so many people out of work because all the people who work in the horse and buggy industry, what is going to happen to them? Wow. Just the opposite. We created new industries. We created new systems, a new lifestyle in the 20th century. And we're on the cusp of that right now in the 21st century. If we can imagine a future, a renewable economy future, if we can imagine the technology we'll take, we can imagine what our lives will be like. When we have renewable transportation, when we have renewable energy all over us, we can build it. I'm putting that challenge to the people of my community here in Texas 22 and across our state for us to be the leader in the country and in the world on renewable technology.
And that's a terrific note to end on. Sri, you've been very, very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Is there a final message you'd like to give to our Muslim and multi-faith audience?
Sure. So I would say this to the Muslim community and to all communities. As we said earlier, we know this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And I mean that in terms of the challenge we face right now from the pandemic. We have to believe in science. We have to have a shared reality. That's what science is about, because we need to address this crisis together. We cannot address our economy. We cannot address our education system. We cannot address our health system, where almost 200,000 people have died, unless we believe in science. But we also have to believe that everyone deserves a seat at the table here. Every community needs to have a voice in our society from all directions. And that's what we are trying to do with this campaign. And lastly, we have to believe in our democracy, our democratic institutions. That means that everybody needs to vote. We cannot sit on the sidelines, especially from the Muslim community, but all communities here. If you look at the diversity that we have across our district, how we pull together people in this coalition, we can and we should be an example for the rest of America and the world of how we work together on our biggest challenges, because it's not about whether you face challenges, it's not about whether you avoid challenges, it's how we rise to them. And I'm confident that as a community in Texas 22, we will rise to our greatest challenges.
Thank you, Sri. That was an excellent point to end on. Rising to our challenges is very important. We have to keep dreaming big in order to hit big goals. And the goals that are in front of us are fairly large. Yeah. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani. I'm the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices through multi-faith and civic engagement. We've had candidate Sri Kulkarni, who's running for Congressional District 22, share very generously some of his time today for our candidate Q&A session, which will continue up until November. His opponent, Sheriff Troy Nels, who's also running as a Republican, has been invited as well, and I think we're working on dates right now. But if you have any more questions for Sri, I'm sure they can reach out to you through Shri2020.com and reach out to your staff and in any language apparently.
Yes.
Are we talking Navajo as well?
Say again?
Navajo, Cherokee, our tribal nation languages covered?
If there's anyone out there, look, that's the bottom line. Anybody who wants to be involved, if there's someone from the Navajo community or the Cherokee community or any community, we campaign in Chinese, Vietnamese, Hindi, Urdu, Turkish, Arabic, Igbo, Yoruba, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever language you speak, we want you as part of our team, because that just enriches our community.
And if you'd like to learn more about our candidate Q&A series and all the candidates that are coming up, please check us out at minaretfoundation.com, like our Facebook page, follow us on Instagram. And as usual, most of the questions that I asked today actually came from our from submissions on our website. So please do submit some of your questions for our candidates online. May God continue to bless our city and our country, make us more inclusive and a prosperous nation, and continue to allow our nation to lead the way. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Sri. May God bless us all.
Thank you, Shar.